800 years ago, in a windswept valley of Central Asia, a grave was dug for the dead. No one then could have imagined that the bones resting beneath the earth would hold a secret powerful enough to rewrite history, a secret so small it could hide inside a tooth, yet strong enough to kill half the known world. The story begins near the waters of Lake Issyk Kul, in present-day Kyrgyzstan. The lake itself is vast and breathtaking, ringed by mountains that scrape against the sky. Its surface shifts like polished glass under the sun, but in the 13th century, this landscape was far from peaceful. Here, just beyond the lake's shore, lay a cemetery. It was not an ordinary resting place. It was crowded, hurried, and marked by unusual inscriptions. The stones told of death, but the words spoke of something more. A sickness that had swept through the community with merciless speed. Imagine walking among those weathered graves. The soil is cracked, dry in some places, damp in others, carrying the faint scent of old earth. Wind whistles through the grass, bending the stalks until they brush against the stone markers. Some of the inscriptions are faded, their meanings lost to time, but others remain chiseled deeply as though the carvers wanted the memory to survive. They speak of sudden endings, whole families lost in a matter of weeks. The dates cluster together, all pointing to a single year, 1338. For centuries, these stones stood quietly, unnoticed by the wider world. Travelers passed through, merchants carried goods along the Silk Road, and empires rose and fell, but the cemetery remained. To the local villagers, it was simply part of the land, a reminder of ancestors long gone. But to historians and scientists, it would one day become the key to unlocking a mystery that haunted humanity. Where did the Black Death truly begin? The Black Death, perhaps the most terrifying name in all of history. It was the pandemic that swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the mid-1300s. Within just a few years, it killed tens of millions of people. Entire towns vanished, families were erased, priests refused to give last rites, doctors turned away the sick. People whispered of God's wrath, of demons, of poisoned wells, but no one truly understood what was happening. And for hundreds of years afterward, one question remained unanswered. Where had this nightmare started? Some believed it began in China. Others thought it came from the Middle East, carried by traders and soldiers. Theories shifted with every new discovery, but none offered proof. It was a mystery buried in time, until those forgotten graves by Lake Issyk Kul revealed their secret. Picture it, a team of archaeologists carefully brushing away soil from a centuries-old grave. The sun beats down, sweat runs across their foreheads, and every movement is deliberate. A rib bone here, a tooth there, all lifted with quiet reverence. At first glance, it's just another excavation. But inside those teeth, something incredible has been preserved. Microscopic traces of the very bacteria that caused the Black Death. It is almost poetic, death preserving the cause of death. Victims, unknowingly, became messengers to the future. Their suffering, frozen in time, waited silently beneath the earth for science to catch up. The cemetery near Lake Issyk Kul, once a lonely patch of ground, is now recognized as the cradle of the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. The story etched into its stones, combined with the power of modern DNA analysis, revealed that the plague had a birthplace, a starting point, a moment when the world first tilted into chaos. This is not just the story of disease, it is the story of how a single microscopic organism reshaped continents, rewrote economies, and forever changed how humans understood life, death, and survival. And it begins, as all stories do, with silence. The silence of graves. The silence of bones. and the silence of secrets waiting to be found. For hundreds of years, the Black Death remained more than just a chapter in history. It was a wound etched into human memory. The pandemic struck in the middle of the 14th century, between 1346 and 1353, and in those 7 short years, the world changed forever. Imagine the Europe of that time. Narrow streets winding between wooden houses, the air thick with the smoke of hearth fires. Merchants calling out their goods in bustling markets. Families gathering around tables at night, lit only by the flickering glow of candles. Life was simple, fragile, and dependent on the rhythms of the land. And then, one by one, the rhythms broke. It began quietly. A cough, a fever, a strange swelling beneath the skin. At first, people thought it was an ordinary illness, nothing that hadn't been seen before. But soon the truth revealed itself in ways too horrifying to ignore. The swellings, called buboes, grew, dark, painful, and deadly. Within days, victims collapsed. Families locked their doors, praying the sickness would pass them by, but the plague slipped in anyway, invisible and unstoppable. The death toll was staggering. In Europe alone, the Black Death claimed the lives of at least 25 million people, nearly half the population. In towns and villages, silence replaced laughter. Bells rang endlessly as priests performed hurried burials, sometimes tossing multiple bodies into the same grave just to keep up with the pace of death. Survivors spoke of streets lined with corpses, of carts pulled by weary men who gathered the dead like fallen wood. To those who lived through it, it must have felt as though the world was ending. Crops withered, trade slowed, and fear spread, faster than the plague itself. Parents abandoned children, husbands and wives turned away from each other. Priests, once pillars of hope, refused to administer last rites out of terror. Nothing felt safe anymore. And yet perhaps the cruelest part was not just the suffering, it was the uncertainty. No one understood why it was happening. People grasped for answers. Some said it was divine punishment, a scourge sent by God to cleanse humanity's sins. Others accused outsiders, foreigners, travelers, even neighbors, of poisoning wells or casting curses. In desperation, entire communities turned to violence, searching for someone to blame when answers could not be found. Fear, after all, is a powerful fuel for cruelty. But even as centuries passed, the true origin of the Black Death remained hidden. Historians, doctors, and scientists all asked the same question. Where had it begun? Theories sprouted like weeds. Many believed the plague had started in China, carried westward along trade routes by caravans and ships. Others suggested the Middle East, pointing to outbreaks in Persia and Baghdad. Still others believed it had emerged in the steppes of Central Asia, carried by rodents that thrived along the Silk Road. But none of these ideas could be proven. The mystery endured because the plague was not a single event. It was a wave, rising and falling over centuries. After the first devastating outbreak in the 1300s, smaller epidemics returned again and again, haunting cities and villages across the world. London, Florence, Paris, Cairo all felt the grip of the disease time after time. But where had the first spark ignited the fire? That question lingered like a shadow, and with every generation, the mystery deepened. The plague had changed history, shaping economies, shifting power, and even influencing art and culture. Yet its true beginning remained a locked door. Scholars could only speculate, tracing patterns in old documents and scattered accounts. But speculation was not certainty. This uncertainty carried weight. For humanity, origins matter. To understand where something begins is to understand its meaning. Without knowing the source of the Black Death, the story of one of history's greatest catastrophes remained incomplete. And so, the question stretched on for centuries, echoing in dusty libraries, whispered in lecture halls, and written into history books with a trailing question mark. Where had it come from? Who had been the first to fall? And why did the silence of those graves near Lake Issyk Kul matter so much? The answers, it turned out, would not come from old writings or fading memories. They would come from something far smaller, far more enduring, and far more silent than any human witness. DNA, the tiny fragile spiral of life, preserved in the teeth of the dead, would finally give humanity the answers it had sought for nearly 700 years. For centuries, historians debated and argued, but the origin of the Black Death remained hidden, like a shadow that refused to take shape. It would take both patience and technology to finally pierce the veil. The breakthrough began not with microscopes or laboratories, but with shovels and brushes in a quiet patch of earth near Lake Issyk Kul. Archaeologists had long known about the cemetery there, but for generations, its significance had been overlooked. Only when scholars began to study the stones more carefully did the pieces start to come together. The inscriptions on the gravestones were unusual. Many of them bore the same date, 1338. And the words etched into the rock spoke not of battle or famine, but of a sudden and devastating pestilence. Entire families were buried within weeks of each other, their final resting places clustered tightly together, as though death had swept through the community like a storm. At first, this was nothing more than a clue, another possibility among many, but then came the bones. When archaeologists carefully lifted the skulls and teeth from the graves, they were not simply retrieving remains, they were retrieving history itself. Teeth, in particular, are like tiny time capsules. Protected by hard enamel, they can preserve traces of DNA for centuries, sometimes even millennia. If the plague had truly been there, its fingerprint might still be locked inside. And so, the samples were sent to laboratories equipped with the latest technology. In ancient DNA analysis, scientists worked meticulously, extracting fragments from the pulp of those medieval teeth. It was delicate work, requiring a balance of precision and patience. Any contamination could erase the evidence. But slowly, strand by strand, the truth emerged. Under the microscope, the fragments of DNA revealed a pattern unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. It was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. But this was not just any strain. Genetic analysis showed that this was the ancestor of all the strains that would later sweep across the world. In other words, those individuals buried near Lake Issyk Kul had died in the earliest wave of the Black Death. The cemetery was not just a graveyard, it was the origin point of one of history's greatest catastrophes. The revelation was breathtaking. Centuries of speculation had finally found solid ground. The inscriptions on the stones, the clustering of deaths in 1338, and the DNA preserved in those silent teeth all told the same story. The Black Death had begun there, in the shadow of the Tian Shan Mountains, before spreading along the arteries of the Silk Road into the wider world. To grasp the weight of this discovery, one must imagine the Silk Road not as a simple road, but as a web of life and movement. Merchants carried silk, spices, and precious stones. Travelers and pilgrims moved between distant lands. Caravans of camels trudged across deserts, while ships sailed from crowded ports into the Mediterranean. Each step, each journey, carried more than goods. It carried life. And hidden within that life were fleas, rats, and bacteria, unseen passengers that would change the course of humanity. The Black Death did not spread in isolation. It traveled with human ambition, with trade, with the ceaseless desire to connect the world. From the quiet graves near Issyk Kul, it followed the lines of commerce and curiosity until it reached the crowded cities of Europe and the Middle East. What began as a spark in Central Asia became an inferno across continents. For the scientists, holding those first results, the moment was overwhelming. To look at the sequence of ancient DNA was to look directly into the face of the past. Here was proof that the plague had a birthplace, a beginning that could finally be named. The victims buried in 1338 were not just forgotten individuals. They were witnesses, their very remains carrying the testimony that no document or memory could provide. And yet, there was a certain poetry in it too. For centuries, the cemetery had been silent. Villagers had walked past it without knowing. The stones had weathered, the names faded. But within those graves, something endured, waiting for the day when human curiosity and scientific progress would meet. It is a humbling thought that even the smallest fragment of DNA can outlast empires, languages, and civilizations. That something microscopic could bridge the gap between the living and the dead, offering answers to questions once thought unanswerable. The discovery was more than just a scientific achievement. It was an act of restoration. It gave a voice back to the people who had died so suddenly, so violently, in 1338. Through their remains, we finally understood where the plague had begun and how its first victims were linked to the billions of people who would live in its shadow. And with that understanding came a new perspective, not just on history, but on humanity itself. For the Black Death was not only a story of loss, it was also a story of survival, of adaptation, and of the strange, fragile resilience of life. From that quiet cemetery near Lake Issyk Kul, the silence of centuries was broken. And the answer, that had eluded the world for so long, was finally, at last, revealed. Section 4. The spread and the emotional ending. From the windswept graves near Lake Issyk Kul, the Black Death began its journey outward. At first, it moved quietly, almost invisibly, hitching rides on the backs of fleas, rats, and merchants. But once it reached the arteries of the Silk Road, the disease no longer crept. It surged. The Silk Road was the lifeline of the 14th century world. It was more than a trade route. It was a vast network of human connection. Camels carried silk and spices across endless deserts. Ships loaded with grain, porcelain, and timber crossed the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Markets buzzed with languages from every corner of the earth. Wherever people traveled, the plague followed. From Central Asia, it moved westward. Traders carried it into Persia, then into the great cities of the Middle East. By 1347, ships docking in the bustling port of Messina in Sicily brought more than goods. They brought death. Rats scurried off the vessels, fleas hidden in their fur, and within days, the plague spread like wildfire through the population. Italy became a furnace of infection. From Florence to Venice, from Genoa to Rome, the disease carved a path of terror. Families shut themselves away, yet the sickness slipped through cracks in doors and gaps in walls. Some cities tried desperate measures, burning incense, quarantining ships, even banning strangers from entering, but the plague cared nothing for human rules. From Italy, it spread north into France and Spain, then across the English Channel, into Britain. By the time it reached London in 1348, the city was overwhelmed. Chronicles describe streets lined with bodies, mass graves filled daily, and churches echoing with the tolling of bells. Entire villages disappeared, abandoned by survivors who fled into the countryside only to carry the sickness with them, and still it spread. Germany, Scandinavia, the Balkans, all were touched by the invisible hand of the plague. To the east, it swept through Russia. To the south, it reached North Africa, devastating Cairo and beyond. In less than a decade, the Black Death reshaped half the known world. The scale of loss is almost impossible to grasp. At least 75 million lives were taken, perhaps even more. In Europe alone, nearly half the population perished. Families were erased. Cities lost entire generations. Crops rotted in the fields because there were no hands left to harvest them. Armies shrank. Kingdoms faltered. The very structure of society trembled under the weight of death. And yet, within this devastation, the story of humanity endured. Survivors carried scars, but they also carried resilience. Communities adapted, finding new ways to farm, trade, and govern. The labor shortage gave peasants new bargaining power, shifting the balance of class and economy. Even art and literature changed, reflecting the darkness of the time but also the stubborn will to live. The Black Death had reshaped humanity, but it had not destroyed it. For centuries, the true origin of this cataclysm remained a mystery. It lingered in speculation and shadow. But now, thanks to the graves at Issyk Kul and the silent testimony of ancient DNA, we know the truth. The story has a beginning, as well as an end, and perhaps that matters more than we realize. To understand where something begins is to honor those who lived through it. The men, women, and children buried in 1338 were not nameless victims. They were the first witnesses of an event that would echo across continents and centuries. By studying their remains, we do not simply learn about disease. We learn about connection, about how the fate of one village can ripple outward to change the fate of the world. There is a quiet lesson here, whispered through time, that humanity is always more connected than it appears. The roads we build, the ships we sail, the cities we crowd into, all bring us together. But they also bind our destinies in ways we do not always see. The same pathways that carried silk, spices, and stories also carried a microscopic killer. As we stand in the present, looking back across 7 centuries, the story of the Black Death reminds us that history is never truly silent. The dead speak if we are willing to listen. They speak through stone, through inscriptions, through the fragile spirals of DNA that outlast flesh and bone. They remind us of fragility, but also of endurance. The cemetery near Lake Issyk Kul, once forgotten and ignored, now holds a place of honor in the story of humanity. It is the place where science and memory meet, where the silence of graves was transformed into knowledge. And in that knowledge, there is something strangely comforting. For even in the face of devastation, humanity seeks to understand. We search for answers, we uncover truths, and we connect the threads of the past to the present. That is what it means to endure, not simply to survive, but to remember. The Black Death was a story of loss, but it is also a story of discovery. And now, at last, it is a story complete.